months, and I had neglected to, this last one I realized I didn't actually proofread it. So I found some pretty grievous errors, and I have corrected all those errors. Here we go. And you'll notice them as we go through, but in my copy I won't have them. There's one, there's two. So don't worry about that. And I have entered it into the record, the corrected copy, and I'll send the corrected copy to the office as well. Now, this session is a review of last year's seminar, all in one time. So it's pretty long. So we're not going to be able to go through every item, every section, but they're all there for you to go back, and you can read those on your own. So this is really kind of a review of what you had last year, or if you weren't here, it's an introduction to the topic of grief recovery and how it is that we work through the grief that we experience in life. Now, the older you get in life, the more grief you are exposed to, and that just comes with the territory. And I started my journey with grief when I was only 14 through the death of my father, which was a tragedy. And then my mother lived to be 88, and that was a blessing. So I got to see both sides of the coin, you might say. First of all, the definition of grief in section 96. Grief is a process marked by a sense of overwhelming loss that includes a mixture of feelings, and I list those there for you, which allows a person to say goodbye to a relationship and be restored to spiritual and emotional wholeness so that they can once again embark upon the journey of life and invest their lives in the lives of others. So that's the whole goal of grief, to once again take up the journey of life. Because in grief, that shuts down your ability to deal with life, just shuts down, and you're stuck in one place, and it's a very hurtful place. And then I list the feelings there for you that you have with grief. And C.S. Lewis was an interesting example of a man who struggled with grief. Here is, or was, a professor at Oxford University, and I went to Oxford and saw his office and visited his home, the kilns where he lived. Very quiet, unassuming man, never married. And then when he was probably 60 years old, he began corresponding with an American divorcee by the name of Joy Davidson, and ends up, they fall in love and get married at that age, if you can imagine. And then, that's not the end of the story. After 5 years or so, she gets cancer and dies. So suddenly, C.S. Lewis, this incredible literary figure of the century, is struggling with grief. And so he wrote a book called A Grief Observed. And here's a quote. He says, "No one ever told me that grief felt so like fear. I am not afraid, but the sensation is like being afraid. The same fluttering in the stomach, the same restlessness, the yawning. And grief still feels like fear, perhaps more strictly like suspense or like a waiting, just hanging about, waiting for something to happen. It gives life a permanently provisional feeling." And then he says on page 55, "I think I am beginning to understand why grief feels like suspense. It comes from frustration, so many impulses that have become habitual, thought after thought, feeling after feeling, action after action, had H for their subject." That was the letter of his wife's name. "Now their target is gone." That's how grief is. You wake up in the morning and suddenly it hits you like a ton of bricks. And then you go to the store and you see something, and that triggers grief because you realize that that was something that your loved one who died loved, liked, and brought home. and it stabs you like a knife in the back. Right now, your chest hurts. The numbness has worn off, and real pain has replaced it. You wonder if you will ever be well again. 1,000 questions flood your mind. 1,000 hurts pop up every day. Every day you'll find a new thing to cause memories and bring tears. You find it hard to sleep. The awful loneliness seems to be there every moment of every day. And that's from Doug Manning's helpful book, Don't Take My Grief Away. Well, the process of grief should be a process, a journey, a movement. It should not be being stuck in one place. If we end up being stuck in one place with our grief, where we're not making any progress, then that's what we call complicated grief, and that really does require counseling. At the University of Chicago was a professor of theology by the name of Martin E. Marty. Suddenly his wife dies, and he's thrown into grief. And, you know, it seems that for every abject tragedy in the world, God redeems it. And the redemption that I saw from this was that it turned Martin Marty into a very, very sensitive and knowing man when it came to grief. And so he wrote a book about it, if you can imagine such a thing. This theology professor who wrote for an audience of theologians, maybe 100 in the world, suddenly is writing for an audience of millions of people. And he said, grief is like a long valley, a winding valley, where any bend may reveal a totally new landscape. As I've already noted, not every bend does. Sometimes the surprise is the opposite one. You're presented with exactly the same sort of country that you thought you had left behind miles ago. That is when you wonder whether the valley isn't a circular trench, but it isn't. There is a partial recurrence, but the sequence doesn't repeat. So it needs to be a progressive experience rather than standing still. Grief can be perceived by us as good or bad, and very often, of course, we have negative feelings towards grief because it makes us sad. Good grief, it can be good when grief is processed and leads to wholeness. And out of this sad, lonely longing comes good and positive things. And we've seen that over and over again where a mother has lost a child, and then that loss spurred them on to an area of life that they never could have imagined they would have been in. Maybe a new job, or starting a foundation to deal with this kind of thing that the daughter died from. The purpose of grief is to enable a bereaved person to love again. And that's from Scott Sullender. I tell you, he really understood grief. And what a great way to put it. Because when you're hurting in grief, how can you ever show love? It's very hard. Bad grief is when grief is unresolved, and that means you're putting it on the shelf and it leads to future problems. And William Justice said, I am saying that all unresolved grief is one of the major contributing factors in the mental illness in our culture today. In hospice, we had a patient, a lady in her late 50s living with her older brother who was in his early 70s. He was her caregiver. His wife had died years before, and she died. And he never processed that grief. He just would not deal with it. And it was about 11 months later that a friend led him into our hospice offices seeking help for him because he was just really a basket case. He was just a wreck. He was weeping and crying out and unable to function. And I had to call mental health to have them come and get him, to take him away and put him in a treatment center because grief had just absolutely wrecked him. And that's what grief does. If we don't process our loss, then it really can do a number on our mental health. Number 98, one fear is that grief is permanent, and if we give into it, like we cry, it may never end. Judy Tattlebaum, who suffered a terrible loss, wrote, "Many of us fear that if allowed in, grief will bowl us over indefinitely. The truth is that the grief experienced does dissolve. The only grief that does not end is grief that has not fully been faced. Grief unexpressed is like a powder keg waiting to be ignited." That's a tough thing to come to grips with for many of us who come from European stock, where we hold our feelings in. Families were never very effusive, wasn't much hugging, and suddenly we're faced with this terrible loss. I remember the first time I did a funeral for a family from the Philippines, and I had no idea what was going to happen. The person from the mortuary tried to warn me, and after the service was over, that's when the wailing began, and they let it all out. And they were taking the children, there were many children, they were taking the children and one by one putting the child into the open coffin with the dead person. And of course, the child is wailing, scared to death, and everyone is wailing, and they're taking pictures of each child in the coffin with the dead person. And I mean, I had to shut this down after an hour because it kept going on. But I can assure you that those people don't have unresolved grief because they go through this extreme thing. When I was in Greece studying, there would be, terrible traffic, two cars practically hitting each other trying to get across the intersection and stopping so the drivers could roll down their windows and yell at each other and talk with their hands like this. And they went home feeling pretty good because they let it all out. And that's culture. So we're dealing with culture in our own lives. We have to say, we have a say in how long this grief period lasts. Doug Manning says it often looks as though they could not hurt anymore, but they still are not ready and must hurt even more. People do not react this way because they are crazy or stubborn. It is just that the pain of getting well must ultimately be less than the pain of staying in their situations. If it hurts less to get well than to stay where you are, you'll start getting well. The time frame for grief, a lot of people say, oh, you'll be over it in a year. Well, if you talk to a family that was shattered by death, that's not true. It can take years. Number 99, although it is true that life may be the same, there's an end to the intense mourning period, although one never really gets over grief. The intense grief is eventually followed by resolution and restoration. The following is only a time frame suggested by some who are grieved. A few resolve their intense grief in less time, some may take longer. The death of a parent, 1 year. The death of a spouse, 2 years. Death of a divorce, 2 to 3 years. It could double that. It could triple that. Depends on the individual. And let's face it, if you lose someone you have loved so dearly, you may, in a sense, never get over it, but you'll learn how to deal with it, to get past it, so life can go on. It's a common mistake to think that if we truly loved, we will never finish sorrowing. Some think that prolonged, unresolved grief is a statement of love rather than what it really is, a pathological grief. So pathological grief or complicated grief needs professional help. And I certainly, as a hospice chaplain, was the first one to suggest that, where you really need to see a psychologist or a psychiatrist to help you with that. So we come to the question number 100, is it okay for Christians to grieve? Well, I know pastors who don't believe so. They don't think the Christians should grieve because it's not right. It shows a lack of faith. And one of those pastors is Lester Sumrall. And I have a long quote from him there where he thinks that grief is in the same category as fear, and that's all because of unbelief. And if we just believed, we wouldn't grieve. I could not disagree more. I believe he's absolutely wrong. And number 100, in item 101, the scripture says, do not grieve like men who have no hope. So it doesn't say you can't grieve, but we don't grieve in the same way as those who have no hope. We do have the hope of the resurrection. We do have the hope of seeing our loved one again. When Lazarus died, what happened? Jesus wept. He wept because Lazarus was gone from his sight. And that's what happens when your loved one dies. That person is gone from our sight. Our grief is for the sadness and the separation while we finish life's journey. In the show of tears, is the show of tears really a denial of faith? Or is it possible for tears to be a proclamation of faith? Now, there's an idea that you have to think about. And I believe that if we go through these kinds of thought processes now, before we have the need for grief, we'll be much farther ahead when it happens. It's like my dog is 19. Well, I mean, come on, how much longer is he going to live? And so I'm preparing myself for the loss of my dog. Now, he's not a person, but he is a thing that I love, and he acts like a person. He doesn't know that he's not a person. He has wants, and he understands the way things work at home. He knows how to get a treat out of me. He knows what to do when he has to go to the bathroom. He stands by the door and looks at me. So preparation is good. Grief acknowledges that the person was God's unique gift to us, that we love that person dearly, that we're going to miss that person, that a beautiful relationship has ended for this life. And then the last thing on the page, our humanity requires us to grieve in order to be restored from the wounds of death. Our grieving is not a sign of unbelief. It is the open acknowledgement of the earthly breaking of a beautiful relationship. Number 102, don't fall into the trap of being brave. Grief needs to be expressed and shared. That's the beauty of a funeral. Especially, I recommend an open casket, because an open casket precipitates grief. And it helps the brain to see that person is actually gone. Because even though you know, cognitively, you know the person is gone, being able to see it with your own eyes is very, very important. Then number 102, but while I was trying to hide my sorrow and loneliness from him, he was trying to do the same for me. And for a 9-year-old boy, the burden of being brave should have been lifted. I could have done it simply by sharing at least a part of my sorrow with him. Then he would not have been ashamed to let me see his. If I could turn the page of time back and relive that first week, I would take Ronnie in my arms and I would hold him while we cried together. So often the actual tragedy of the death does result in people writing about it in order to share. Our culture has the idea that to grieve shows weakness. We must be brave and not shed a tear, at least not in public. And one funeral director who holds a master's degree in social work recently went so far as to say that Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, with her magnificent public stoicism at the funeral of the assassinated president, said grieving back 100 years. I saw that. I was very young. And I wondered how she could do that. And that is not the model that we want for grieving. That's wrong. When faced with the catastrophic, don't try to be brave. Let the grief out. Number 103, the shedding of tears is important, and yet crying is often discouraged. And people will say, oh, don't cry. And the reason is, if you cry, I might cry. Or if you cry, I might know that I too am in pain. If you cry, I might feel self-conscious about my own difficulty in crying. If you cry, I might have to face the unpleasantness in my or your life. If you cry, I might not be able to maintain my pose of strength or dignity or whatever. If you cry, I might cry for all the pain in my own life and never stop crying. But crying is healthy. There's no substitute for that. So if you're with someone who is crying, the last thing you need to tell her or him is don't cry. So this brings us to the topic, do men cry? Well, I spent a long time in the fire department, 58 years, and I'll tell you that's a culture where men don't cry. It's a macho thing, but they've got it wrong. William Justice said, when others, this is number 104, when others are not trying to stop people from crying, they're trying to stop themselves. The release of tears is thought to be a show of weakness. Men especially have a hard time here. Many have heard all their lives, men don't cry. Masculinity is at stake. One man said it classically, I'm afraid that if I cry, I will turn into a woman. People who are emotionally, physically, and spiritually healthy do cry at the appropriate time, and the loss of tears, the loss of a loved one is an appropriate time. Any man who loses his masculinity with a few tears had little masculinity to begin with. And then number 105, in order to bring us to wholeness, a grief must enable us to reach 4 goals. And here are the 4 goals of grieving. Number 1, the first goal of grieving is to face the reality of our loss. And that path, I believe, is best begun by viewing the body. And that's the advantage of it. Now, if you want cremation, you can do that after you view the body. But I do believe that there are significant psychological and emotional advantages to having an open casket. And I know that's not followed today a lot. It's too old-fashioned. It's like the wake. But I tell you, back in Iowa when they had the all-night wake, that solved more grief problems. That helped grief more than anything. The family needs to have time alone with the body. We must experience the pain of the loss in order to assess the enormity of what it means in our life. And that's the thing, that when it happens, how you come to grasp it, how do you bring it in? How do you make it part of your experience? How does your mind really come to grips with the fact that he or she is gone? Facing the reality means that there will be times of utter despair even for the person of faith. Here are the words of C.S. Lewis as he agonized over the reality of the death of his beloved wife, Joy. I look up at the night sky. Is anything more certain than that in all those vast times and spaces, if I were allowed to search them, I should nowhere find her face, her voice, her touch? Goal number 2, second goal of grieving, to say goodbye to our loved one. The death of the person is also the death of the relationship. This strikes at the fundamental structure of personal existence, which is shared humanity. And again, we come back to Ray Anderson. And remember, Dr. Anderson is the one who said to us in class one day that my hope for you is out of every course, and each course then was only $385. I hate to think what it is now. But out of the $385 that you spent, that you'll get at least one principle that you can take with you into life. And this is one of those principles. You'll have to read this over and over again to try to get it in your mind. Human personhood is a determination of creaturely being in such a way that co-humanity is the fundamental structure of personal existence. Whew. Try to get your arms around that. It takes a lot of time. His courses were the best, I'll tell you. I took every course that he offered. This fundamental structure of personal existence is shaken by the ending of a relationship. Saying goodbye is our official acknowledgement that the precious relationship has ended. Failure to do this can result in a burden of misplaced feelings which can fester for years. Goodbye can be said years later, and here's an example again of Judy Tattlebaum. Her brother had tragically died some 14 years before she wrote this. Through working on an angry dream, I discovered my unfinished business with David, my secret anger at him for dying, anger which was unacceptable to me. At last I was able to say goodbye to David, and I realized afterward 2 years of depression as well. Number 107, the process of saying goodbye begins with actually saying it to the body. Many months and goodbyes later, the process is finally completed. So picture the wife who now confronts the body of her husband. And in this quote, we see a lady, a wife, who talks to her husband, and before she always got a response, but now no response. And as she talks to the body and gets no response, it comes into her brain that he truly is gone. And the body is, he says here, indifferent, non-giving, unresponsive. That silence and unresponsiveness are often felt as a kind of rejection that helps facilitate the breaking of the ties between them. It helps her to let go of the relationship. By the severing of that tie, it inflicts a gaping wound across the soul. Sheldon Van Auken describes the way that he said goodbye to his deceased wife. He went through all their letters. He was a student of C.S. Lewis, by the way. He studied their life together using their letters, diaries, going over a period of 20 years. And he said this, "Now I learned a great principle in the way the grief operates. As I went through the past day by day, 10,000 forgotten or half-forgotten memories of Davy came into me with all the color and vividness of life. For one instant, that particular Davy stands before me, warm and real and alive, and I respond to her with a surge of love and joy." And this then is followed by the realization that that Davy is dead. And so he went through all of the Davies. He must say goodbye to every one. Number 109, why must the ties that bind be broken? Well, when I go on a trip alone, I maintain the ties that bind me to my wife because our relationship has a future in earthly time. And Dr. Anderson would add, this relationship means the singularity of my humanity is determined by the other. And singularity means discrete individuality. So my discrete individuality is determined by the other. So who I am as a person then becomes determined, at least in part, by my wife. In a living relationship, this determination is constantly and consistently taking place, but sometimes the relationship dies without the death of the relationship here on earth. So one lady said, "I divorced Jim because our relationship had no future. Because of death, these ties must be broken, and because there is no future for that relationship here on earth. In the one instant of death, the relationship loses its future on earth and becomes a thing of the past." And Sheldon Van Auken wrote to me in a letter, "As to your 20 years, it's our anniversary." So that means our anniversary was just last week. So, no, it was, gosh, that time goes by fast. It was on the 12th. Our 60th. So this was 40 years ago. 40 years ago, Sheldon Van Auken wrote to me, "We had almost as long, you know. But of course you all have 20 years and the expectation of more, which for us suddenly, overnight, vanished. The future of the relationship waits patiently for consummation when both lovers complete life's journey on earth. And it's not possible again to set out on the journey of life unless these ties are broken." Goal 3, the third goal of grief: restoration to spiritual and emotional wholeness. One who mourns is a wounded person. Each tie that is severed inflicts a gaping wound across the soul. It's most urgent that this goal be achieved, otherwise it is impossible to once again set out on the journey of life. So support leading towards restoration comes from family and friends, the community of faith, and from yourself. And I've been intrigued through the years, in all of my years of grief work and working with people who are grieving, at the hidden strength that comes from within. People who you never would guess were able to find this hidden strength to carry them through. And faith plays a part according to its maturity. The writer says, "I now have seen what happens to people who have not taken seriously the necessity of working at their faith when the going was good. People of faith do not suddenly get that way. Like the athlete who must stay in training, these people are always in training for whatever may come at any time. When loss comes, they are ready for it." Very perceptive look at faith and what it means. So what are you getting out of going to church? Well, you're working on your faith, and that's a good thing. Section 112, use simple affirmations by writing them down and writing your reaction to them. You can do things like, "I can make it through today with God's help." And you can write about that. "The Lord will give me strength I need to cope. I can overcome my grief and build a new life. Never again will I have unfinished business with my loved ones. From now on, I will live every day to the fullest." Those are all things, affirmations, to which you can respond. Now, our fourth goal of grief: to set out again on the journey of life. All forward movement in life stops during the mourning period. When one reaches this goal, one is ready to invest in the lives of others once more. It's hard to love again after a terrible hurt. Setting out again may mean a change in direction, new horizons, new ideas. It may become a journey to answer a question. God, how could you let my father, a good man, die? To review the 4 goals of grief: number 1, to face the reality of our loss, section 105. Number 2, to say goodbye to our loved ones, section 106. Number 3, to restore the spiritual and emotional wholeness, section 110. Number 4, to set out again on the journey of life, section 113. Now I want to look at just a couple special problems of death. One is the special problem of sudden death, when there's no time to say goodbye. There's no time to take care of the problems that you were having together. And that is the greatest barrier to grief recovery. This unresolved relationship problem where you weren't able to straighten it out and the person died. People are filled with regrets. No time to work on the 5 stages of personal crisis. No time to begin to grieve in advance. An overwhelming sense of shock makes it difficult to function at any level. You almost feel as though while the earth is going around, you've gotten off and you're standing there in one place watching the world go by. That's how I felt. And then number 115, I can't end without talking about suicide. I define suicide as an attempt to restore order, and that order is found in the Imago Dei, the image of God that we all have. In other words, we're given that sense of need for order. to the disorder found in the world. Suicide is an attempt for meaning. Suicide is a human's attempt to give a final human meaning to a life which has become humanly meaningless. Recognize the extreme suffering which must have driven the victim to this desperate act. Relate this suffering to the suffering of Jesus on the cross. We cannot judge the hearts and deeds of others in their extremity. God's grace, goodness, and mercy are great enough to grant forgiveness, even in this situation. And I will have you know that this is the position now of the Catholic Church. I mean, that's an amazing thing, that this monolithic body that never changes through the ages, that so roundly condemned suicide up through the 19th century, is now saying that if it's in extremis, God's grace covers it, and they declare suicide to be in extremis. So that is a refreshing thing. Dietrich Bonhoeffer goes on and says, insufficient, too, is the argument which is widely used in the Christian church to the effect that suicide rules out the possibility of repentance and therefore also of forgiveness. It is not the right to life that can overcome this temptation to suicide, but only the grace which allows a person to continue to live in the knowledge of God's forgiveness. But who would venture to say that God's grace and mercy cannot embrace and sustain even a man's failure to resist the hardest of all temptations? And it's interesting that Bonhoeffer would use that phrase, the hardest of all temptations, because it was about the turn of the 19th century, around 1900, that a very famous German theologian, world-famous man, wrote these words. He said, suicide is man's greatest temptation. So one of the greatest problems of suicide, that it shows the way for future generations. And that's something that every person must consider. Do you really want to do that? And then have your granddaughter do that? Or have unknown generations do that? Number 116, the unique problem of grief in children. And it's interesting that in my practice, I found that children were far more accepting of death than adults. I suggest explaining things in a straightforward way. Daddy was killed in the accident, and then Jesus took him to be with him in heaven. The best preparation is the death of pets. A child can learn to grieve through grieving for pets. The adolescent is the most devastated. Just at the stage of trying to understand his growing body and where he is in his or her attempt at growing up, just when he or she needs the bonding to mother or father as he begins to move out of childhood roles and into adult ones. It's very bad. And the last one is 117, God understands our grief. Jesus was called a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief, and yet he said, blessed are those who mourn. What would the loved one say to you in your grief? And those are thoughts that have inspired countless verse that you find at, and you go to a funeral, they have this little program and they have some little poem that says some little things. And after you've done it for a lot of years, you kind of get tired of reading that stuff. But I came upon this statement and I thought, wow, that's pretty powerful. So I leave that statement for you to read. What would your loved ones say to you in your grief? Now, I have time for questions. I think that ends it. It's a heavy topic, a lot of stuff. You can share experience. You can have a question.
Pastor, when my wife died, we went through, she wanted to be cremated. So we did that. We didn't have an open casket. And I wondered if that was perhaps a mistake, that we didn't follow that advice.
Well, number one is there's no right way for every family, okay? Let's start with that. We're all different. For some families, that may be the appropriate thing to do. You have to decide. I firmly believe that the best thing is an open casket. It really helps the grieving process. It moves things along. And my wife doesn't want cremation, so we won't do that, but we will have an open casket. Any other questions you have? And I don't want to appear like I'm giving you, this is the only way, anything that I said. It's all of this is a big personal equation and everything. It depends on your family, your culture, where you're from, how you're used to doing things, the way you live. I mean, let's face it, over the cemetery, I've had, committals, and after with a committal, they got up and all poured beer on the ground, on the grave. That was appropriate for them. I'd have a heart attack doing that for my loved one. So it's all modifiable. And I'm in the midst of I'm halfway through writing next year's seminar. And so that is really, really good to be this far, finally getting myself organized. And it'll be on a topic a little somewhat better than this. And then, like I told my wife, maybe the next year I should do a seminar on 10 ways to win the lottery or something. Really easy. We'll see. All right. Thank you for coming.